Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something electric, not just in colour, but in feeling, strokes of paint that seem to pulse with life itself. Some say they were born from beauty, others from pain, from the mind of a man who saw the world differently, brighter, sharper, yet somehow more fragile. But tonight, we won't try to diagnose him, we'll just listen to him. We'll trace the swirls of his skies, feel the weight of his loneliness, and wonder, was this brilliance a gift or a wound? Picture a small room in the late 1800s. The air smells faintly of oil paint and turpentine. The light filtering in through the window is soft and golden, casting long shadows over a canvas propped against the wall. At that canvas stands a man with fiery hair and piercing eyes. His clothes are worn, his hands stained with colours that seem pulled from another world. This is Vincent van Gogh, a man who will one day be called a genius and yet, in his own lifetime, be seen as little more than a failure. Vincent was not born into fame or fortune. He was the son of a Protestant minister in the Netherlands, growing up in a family that valued education and religion, but struggled to understand him. From the start, he seemed different, restless. He tried different careers, working as an art dealer, a teacher, a missionary. Yet nothing seemed to hold him for long. It was as if there was an invisible fire inside him, pushing him forward, but never letting him rest. That fire would eventually lead him to painting, but it would also consume him. When Vincent finally turned to art in his late 20s, he was already behind compared to other artists of his time. Many had been training since childhood. Vincent, however, taught himself through tireless practice and obsessive study. He sketched for hours every day, experimenting with light, shadow, and form. He painted peasants' fields and workers with heavy, earthy colours that reflected the weight of their lives. These early works were far from the bright, swirling visions we now associate with his name, but they carried a depth of feeling that set him apart. His move to Paris in 1886 was a turning point. Paris at the time was the beating heart of the art world, bursting with new ideas and movements. Vincent met Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. He saw bold colours and loose brushwork that broke the rules of traditional art. Something in him shifted. His palette exploded with yellows, blues, and reds. He painted flowers, streets, cafes, and portraits that seemed to vibrate with life. It was here that Vincent's style began to take shape, a style that would one day define modern art. But beneath this creative explosion, there was a shadow. Vincent's letters to his brother Theo reveal a mind that could soar into joy and sink into despair with terrifying speed. He struggled with isolation, even in the crowded streets of Paris. Friends admired his work, but many found him intense and unpredictable. He drank heavily, smoked constantly, and worked until exhaustion overtook him. It was as if each painting drained a piece of his soul, and yet he could not stop. In 1888, Vincent moved to Arles in the south of France, chasing light, warmth, and a dream of building an artist's community. Here he painted some of his most famous works: sunflowers, the yellow house, the cafe terrace at night. The colours were fierce, almost blinding. The brushstrokes danced across the canvas like living things. Vincent was trying to capture the world as he felt it, not just as he saw it. But in Arles, his mental health began to unravel in a way that would soon become legend. The most infamous moment came in December of that year. After a violent argument with his friend Paul Gauguin, Vincent cut off part of his own ear. He wrapped it in paper and gave it to a woman at a local brothel. No one can say exactly why he did it. Some believe it was a cry for help, others a fit of rage or confusion. What is certain is that this act marked the beginning of a period of severe instability. Yet even during his darkest moments, Vincent painted with unstoppable energy. He filled canvas after canvas with fields of wheat, cypress trees, and star-filled skies. His paintings seemed to hold both his torment and his hope, as if the act of painting was his way of holding on to the world. When words failed him, colours spoke. By the time Vincent died in 1890 at the age of 37, he had created over 2,000 artworks, yet in his lifetime he sold only a handful. To most he was an unknown, a man whispered about for his madness rather than his mastery. Only years later would the world recognize the brilliance that had burned so fiercely within him. And so the question remains, was Van Gogh's genius born from his suffering, or did his suffering simply coexist with it? To begin to answer that, we must walk deeper into his life. We must look not only at the paintings, but at the man himself and the storms that shaped him. Long before the swirling skies and blazing sunflowers, Vincent van Gogh was a quiet and awkward boy. Growing up in the small Dutch village of Zundert, he was born on March 30th, 1853, to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant pastor, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, a woman with a love for nature and art. His birth was shadowed by a strange and heavy truth. Exactly 1 year before Vincent's arrival, his parents had lost their firstborn son, also named Vincent Willem van Gogh. The baby had died at birth and was buried in the local cemetery. On the day of Vincent's own birthday, each year, he would walk past a gravestone bearing his own name. This eerie fact weighed on him in ways that are hard to measure. Imagine growing up knowing you were in some way a replacement for a child who never lived. You might begin to feel that you were living in the shadow of someone who could never be replaced. Family portraits and memories were already set before you even existed. This strange burden gave Vincent a deep sense of melancholy and loneliness from a young age, and it would follow him into adulthood. Vincent's early years were marked by a restless spirit. He loved to wander through fields and gardens, studying flowers, birds, and the play of sunlight on leaves. His mother encouraged his sketching, but his father hoped he would follow a more stable path. Like many children who feel torn between expectation and passion, Vincent learned to keep much of his inner world to himself. He was not the loudest or most confident child. Instead, he was observant always, watching and absorbing details others missed. School was never easy for him. He attended several boarding schools, but struggled to fit in with the other boys. His handwriting was messy, his social skills awkward, and his moods unpredictable. He could be deeply kind and warm one moment and withdrawn the next. This inability to adapt to structured life would become a recurring pattern in his later years. Even as a child, he seemed like a man searching for something he could never fully name. By the time Vincent was a teenager, he was sent to work for his uncle in The Hague, who ran an art dealership. This seemed like a perfect match. He was surrounded by paintings and prints, learning about artists and customers and the business of selling art. At first, Vincent threw himself into the job with energy and curiosity. But over time, his enthusiasm dimmed. The commercial side of art left him cold. He disliked the way paintings were treated, like mere commodities, bought and sold, without a thought for the artist's soul. This period of his life also revealed another truth about Vincent. He could not bend himself to fit the expectations of others. When he believed in something, he spoke his mind, and often it cost him opportunities. His blunt honesty made him seem rude, even when he meant no harm. Eventually, his employers sent him to work in London, but his time there was marked by loneliness and unrequited love. He fell deeply for a woman named Ursula Lawyer, who did not return his feelings. The rejection crushed him, and he withdrew further into himself. When he finally left the art dealership, Vincent drifted between jobs and ideas. He tried teaching, he attempted to become a minister like his father, and he even worked as a missionary in a poor mining district in Belgium. Each time he threw himself into his work with a desperate need to give meaning to his life. But each time he left, disillusioned. He was too passionate, too intense, and too uncompromising to follow conventional paths. Yet through all these failures, a seed was quietly growing. The sketches he made of miners' fields and the poor revealed an instinctive eye for composition and a deep empathy for the human condition. In many ways, Vincent's difficult childhood and restless youth prepared him for the artist he would become. The loneliness, the early brush with death, the constant feeling of being out of step with the world. These experiences deepened his sensitivity. He was learning to see not just with his eyes, but with his emotions. He could capture not just how a scene looked, but how it felt. That ability would become the foundation of his genius. Still, at this stage, painting was not yet his life. It was a habit, an outlet, not a calling. That calling would only come later when his need to express himself became so great that no other path could contain it. For now, he remained a wanderer, moving from one place to another, chasing a sense of belonging that always seemed just beyond reach. Looking back, it is easy to trace the line from the boy in Zundert to the man who painted Starry Night, the quiet hours spent sketching flowers, the walks through the countryside, the rejection and disappointment, the strange presence of a gravestone with his name on it. All of these threads would one day be woven into his canvases. But at the time, Vincent could not have known where they would lead. He only knew that the world around him felt sharper, more intense, and somehow more fragile than it did for others. And that feeling, both a gift and a burden, would never leave him. By the time Vincent van Gogh decided to dedicate himself fully to art, he was 27 years old. For many, this would have been the age to settle into a stable career, to build a future with security. But Vincent had already tried and failed at so many paths that he was no longer interested in safety. He wanted meaning, and the only place he had ever truly felt that spark was with a pencil or brush in hand. It began in earnest during his time in the Borinage, a poor coal mining region in Belgium. Vincent had gone there as a missionary, determined to help the miners and their families. He lived in near poverty, giving away much of what he had to those in need. But his radical generosity and unconventional approach to preaching did not please the church authorities, and he was eventually dismissed. This was another crushing failure, yet it was in this failure that something important shifted. During his time among the miners, Vincent had been sketching their faces, their homes, and the bleak landscapes around them. He was moved by the harsh beauty of their lives and the quiet dignity with which they endured suffering. The act of drawing these scenes brought him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He began to wonder if his calling was not to save souls through sermons, but to tell their stories through images. From that moment, Vincent's commitment to art became absolute. He returned to his parents' home and began studying and practicing relentlessly. He read art books, copied prints, and sketched anything he could see. His early work was dark and heavy in tone, often painted in browns, greys, and deep greens. These colors reflected the weight of the subjects he chose. Farmers working the fields, old men hunched in prayer, women sewing by lamplight. There was no glamour in these scenes, only truth. Vincent admired artists who portrayed working people with honesty and respect. His hero at the time was Jean-François Millet, a French painter known for his depictions of rural life. Millet's paintings showed peasants not as faceless laborers, but as human beings with dignity and soul. Vincent adopted this approach wholeheartedly. He believed that art should not only be beautiful, but also compassionate, capturing the essence of life as it truly was. Despite his growing passion, Vincent faced enormous challenges. He had little money and relied heavily on the financial support of his younger brother Theo. Theo was an art dealer in Paris and one of the few people who fully believed in Vincent's potential. The two brothers wrote hundreds of letters to each other over the years, and these letters remain one of the most intimate records of an artist's inner life. Through them, we see Vincent's struggles, his bursts of inspiration, and his unshakable determination, even when the world seemed indifferent to his work. His first major breakthrough came in 1885 with The Potato Eaters. This painting showed a group of peasants gathered around a dimly lit table, their rough hands reaching for simple food. The scene was raw, almost harsh, capturing the tough reality of rural life. Vincent saw this painting as a triumph, but the critics were less kind. They found the figures clumsy, the colors too dark. Yet Vincent did not waver. He believed he was capturing something real, something that could not be polished into prettiness without losing its truth soon after. The potato eaters. Vincent realized that he needed to expand his skills and broaden his vision. He began studying color theory and the works of newer artists who were experimenting with bolder palettes and looser brushwork. This curiosity would eventually pull him toward Paris, where his art would transform completely. But before that transformation could happen, Vincent had to endure yet another period of isolation and self-doubt. In these years before Paris, his life was a cycle of intense creation, followed by deep exhaustion. He worked obsessively, painting or drawing for hours at a time, barely eating or resting. His health suffered and his mental state became increasingly fragile. Yet the more fragile he felt, the more he seemed to pour himself into his canvases, as if each stroke was a way of holding the world together. This was the awakening of the artist we now remember. It was not a sudden explosion of genius, but a slow, relentless climb built on hardship, rejection, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Vincent was beginning to discover his voice in paint, a voice that spoke with both tenderness and urgency. He had not yet found the bright colors and swirling skies that would define his later work. But the foundation was being laid. Looking back, this period reveals the essence of Vincent van Gogh's journey. He was not born a celebrated genius. His greatness came from persistence, from the courage to embrace failure, and from the willingness to see beauty in places others overlooked, in the miners' weary faces in the soil, caked hands of farmers in the dim glow of a single lamp. Vincent saw a truth worth capturing, and in choosing to paint that truth, he set himself on the path that would lead to immortality. In the spring of 1886, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris, carrying little more than his paintbrushes and the quiet determination to transform his art. The city was alive with energy, a place where every street corner seemed to hold a new idea or a new way of seeing the world. For an artist hungry for growth, Paris was both a challenge and a revelation. Theo van Gogh, who was working as an art dealer, welcomed his brother into his apartment in Montmartre, a neighborhood pulsing with creativity. Painters, poets, and musicians filled the cafes with talk of revolution in art. The air smelled of tobacco wine and freshly mixed pigments, and the walls were often covered in unfinished canvases waiting to come to life. It was here that Vincent first encountered the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, whose work would change the course of his career. Until this point, Vincent's paintings had been heavy in tone and color, earthy and shadowed. But in Paris, he was confronted with a world of light. The Impressionists used quick, bright strokes to capture fleeting moments. Their colors were not blended, but placed side by side, allowing the eye to mix them from a distance. This approach gave their paintings a shimmering quality, as if the air itself had been trapped on canvas. Vincent studied their techniques with obsessive focus. He examined the works of Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, Edgar Degas, and others. He saw how they captured the play of sunlight on water, the vibrancy of city streets, and the glow of gardens in bloom. These artists painted the world not as it was in strict detail, but as it felt in a single moment. This was a revelation to Vincent, who had long sought to paint emotion as much as reality. He began experimenting with a brighter palette and looser brushwork. The transformation was immediate. Gone were the muted browns and greys of his early work. In their place came vivid blues, blazing yellows, and lush greens. His portraits became more alive, his still lifes more luminous. He painted flowers with petals that seemed to quiver in the light, and cafe scenes that buzzed with quiet warmth. Paris was also where Vincent formed friendships that pushed him further. Paul Signac introduced him to the technique of pointillism, placing tiny dots of color in patterns to form an image. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec admired Vincent's intensity and encouraged his unique style. Even when their personalities clashed, these artists challenged him to think differently and take risks. Yet the city was not without its toll. Vincent's social awkwardness and unpredictable moods often made it difficult for him to fit in. The noise and bustle of Paris could be overwhelming, and he frequently retreated into solitude to recover. He was drinking heavily, smoking constantly, and working to the point of exhaustion. Theo worried about his health, but also recognized that Paris was shaping Vincent into a bolder, more confident painter. During his time in the city, Vincent created hundreds of works. Many were portraits of friends and strangers alike, faces filled with character and life. Others were studies of flowers, fruit, and urban scenes. His brushstrokes grew more assured, each painting a step closer to the signature style that would later make him famous. But even as his art flourished, Vincent felt the pull of the countryside. He longed for open skies, fields of wheat, and the kind of golden light that Paris could not give him. He dreamed of creating an artist colony in the south of France, a place where painters could live and work together in harmony. This dream would soon lead him to Arles and to some of the most brilliant yet turbulent years of his life. Paris had given him the tools he needed, the colors, the techniques, and the courage to push beyond the boundaries of traditional art. It had shown him that painting could be as much about feeling as about form. It had also deepened his connection to Theo, whose unwavering support made this transformation possible. Without Paris, Vincent might never have found the intensity of vision that would define his greatest works. When he finally left the city in 1888, Vincent was not the same man who had arrived 2 years earlier. He carried with him a new language of color and light, a willingness to bend reality in order to express the soul of a scene. And though he did not yet know it, the next chapter of his life would bring both the height of his creative power and the depths of his personal suffering. When Vincent van Gogh stepped off the train in Arles in February 1888, he felt as if he had entered another world. The cold, grey skies of Paris were behind him, and in their place was the dazzling sunlight of southern France. The air was warmer, the colours more intense, and the rhythm of life slower, in a way that soothed his restless spirit. He had come searching for light, for inspiration, and for a place where he could finally build the community of artists he had long imagined. Arles was a small town surrounded by fields, olive groves, and rolling hills. The light there had a golden clarity that seemed to reveal every detail of the landscape. Vincent was immediately captivated. He began painting at an almost frantic pace, capturing the blossoming orchards, the stone bridges, and the quiet streets. His brush moved with new confidence, as if the sun itself was guiding his hand. The colors grew even bolder than in Paris. The yellows burned brighter, the blues deepened into rich sapphires, and the greens shimmered with life. One of Vincent's first great inspirations in Arles was the series of paintings that would become known as the sunflowers. He painted them not once, but several times. Each version slightly different. The thick curling petals seemed to radiate warmth and joy, yet they also carried a hint of melancholy, as if Vincent saw in them the fleeting nature of beauty. These works were meant to decorate the home. He dreamed of sharing with other artists a place he had already chosen and rented the Yellow House. The Yellow House was small but filled with potential. Vincent imagined it as a creative haven where painters could live, work, and inspire each other. He invited his friend, Paul Gauguin, to join him, believing that together they could spark a movement of shared artistic vision. While he waited for Gauguin's arrival, Vincent threw himself into preparing the house, painting its walls and filling it with his own artwork. He painted portraits of locals, scenes of the countryside, and still lifes of flowers and fruit. Each canvas was another brick in the dream he was building. When Gauguin finally arrived in October, the early days were filled with excitement. The two artists painted side by side and took long walks through the countryside, discussing art philosophy and their own ambitions. Gauguin admired Vincent's fearless use of color, and Vincent was fascinated by Gauguin's bold compositions, but living and working together proved to be far more difficult than either had imagined. Their personalities could not have been more different. Vincent was intense, impulsive, and deeply emotional, Gauguin was more detached, calculating, and often critical. At first, these differences led to passionate debates that fueled their creativity, but over time, the tensions grew sharper. Vincent's mental health, which had always been fragile, began to strain under the pressure of trying to hold both his vision and his friendship with Gauguin together. The breaking point came in December 1888. After a particularly heated argument, the details of that night remain uncertain, but what is known is that Vincent suffered a severe mental crisis. In the aftermath, he famously cut off part of his own ear, wrapped it, and brought it to a local brothel. This shocking act would become one of the most infamous moments in art history. Gauguin left Arles soon after, and the dream of the Yellow House as an artist community collapsed. Yet even in the midst of this personal disaster, Vincent's creative output did not stop. In fact, some of his most extraordinary works were created during and after this period. His painting, The Bedroom, captured the simplicity and peace he had longed for in the Yellow House. The Night Cafe, with its deep reds and greens, conveyed the restless energy and loneliness that haunted him. And of course, the sunflowers continued to glow with an almost defiant beauty. Arles was both a triumph and a tragedy for Vincent. It was here that he reached the peak of his creative powers, producing more than 200 paintings in just over a year. It was also here that his mental health suffered its most public collapse. Yet perhaps the two were connected. Perhaps the same intensity that fueled his art also made his mind fragile. The same fire that lit up his canvases burned within him without restraint when Vincent finally left Arles in 1889 to enter the asylum at Saint-Rémy. It was with mixed feelings. He had loved the light, the fields, and the small town streets, but he had also been wounded by the breakdown of his dream. The Yellow House stood as a reminder of what could have been and what had been lost. Still, the paintings he created there remain some of the most beloved in the world, glowing with the warmth of the sun that first drew him to the south of France. Arles had shown Vincent that his vision could be as bright and boundless as the sky above the fields. Yet it also revealed that his quest for beauty and meaning came at a cost, one that he would continue to pay for the rest of his life. In May 1889, Vincent van Gogh made a decision that few artists of his time would have considered. He admitted himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. He did this not because he had given up on life or art, but because he hoped that in the quiet and order of the institution he might find some measure of peace. His mind had become an unpredictable storm, and he feared the harm it could cause, both to himself and to those around him. Saint-Rémy was housed in a former monastery, surrounded by high stone walls and fields of olive trees. The building was simple but solid, with cool shadowed corridors and rooms lit by narrow windows. From the moment Vincent arrived, he began to paint. The asylum allowed him to keep his brushes and paints, and provided a small studio where he could work when he was well enough. Painting remained his lifeline, the one constant that could give shape to the chaos in his mind. The landscape around the asylum was unlike anything he had painted before. Olive groves stretched out in gnarled rows, their silvery leaves shimmering in the wind. Beyond them, the Alpilles Mountains rose sharply, their jagged outlines cutting into the sky. Vincent would walk through the gardens and fields, sketching what he saw, and later transforming those sketches into vivid paintings. In these works, the land seems alive, every tree twisting with its own rhythm, every hill breathing with hidden energy. It was during this period that Vincent painted one of his most famous works, The Starry Night. The view from his barred window became a vision of a swirling night sky, alive with motion and light. The stars burned like suns. The moon glowed with a strange calm, and below them, the small village seemed almost to sleep beneath the vastness of it all. The painting was not an exact copy of what he saw, but rather what he felt: the endless movement of the heavens and the restless turning of his own thoughts. Life in the asylum was not without its difficulties. Vincent's mental health continued to fluctuate. There were periods when he was lucid, focused, and able to work with intensity. Then, without warning, he would fall into deep episodes of confusion, fear, or exhaustion. These attacks could leave him unable to paint for days or even weeks. Yet each time he recovered, he returned to his easel with renewed urgency, as if he knew his moments of clarity were precious and fleeting. Theo remained his most steadfast supporter, sending money supplies and encouragement through letters. Vincent's correspondence from Saint-Rémy reveals a man who was both deeply aware of his illness and determined not to let it define him. He wrote about his desire to keep working, to keep creating beauty, even in confinement. For Vincent, painting was not simply a profession, it was an act of survival. During his year at the asylum, he produced some of his most striking works: fields of golden wheat under turbulent skies, cypress trees reaching upward like flames, and portraits of the doctors and attendants who cared for him. In each canvas there was an intensity that seemed to come from the very edge of his experience, a blending of reality and emotion that made the scenes vibrate with life. One recurring subject was the garden of the asylum itself. Vincent painted it in every season, capturing the blooming irises in spring, the warm ochres of summer, and the fading colors of autumn. These works were not grand landscapes, but intimate moments of connection to the world outside his room. They were proof that even in a place meant for recovery and isolation, he could still find beauty worth recording. Yet Vincent could not ignore the fact that his condition was worsening. The episodes came more frequently and with greater force. He sometimes feared that his mind might eventually silence him completely. Still, he refused to stop creating. As long as he could hold a brush, he would try to put his vision into the world. By the time he left Saint-Rémy in May 1890, Vincent had produced more than 150 paintings. His stay had not cured him, but it had given him a year of remarkable productivity and moments of clarity in which he could see the world in a way that few ever have. He had taken the confines of the asylum and turned them into a frame for some of the most moving works in art history. The time in Saint-Rémy proved that even in the depths of suffering, Vincent's spirit could still reach toward beauty and light. It also showed that his genius was not separate from his struggles, but somehow intertwined with them. The storms in his mind may have shaken him, but they also seemed to give him a way of seeing the world that was uniquely his own. When Vincent van Gogh left the asylum at Saint-Rémy in May 1890, he carried with him a portfolio of paintings that spoke of both beauty and turmoil. His brother Theo worried for his health, but also wanted him to be in a place where he could recover away from the pressures of the city. Theo suggested that Vincent move to the small village of Auvers-sur-Oise, just north of Paris. It was quiet, peaceful, and home to Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician known for his interest in treating mental illness and his sympathy for artists. Vincent arrived in Auvers at the end of May and was immediately struck by the charm of the place. The village was surrounded by wheat fields dotted with farmhouses and shaded by tall chestnut trees. The Oise River wound gently through the landscape, and the air carried the scents of grass and wildflowers. For Vincent, it was a setting that seemed to promise both rest and inspiration. He quickly rented a modest room at the Ravou Inn and began to explore the countryside with his sketchbook and paints. Dr. Gachet became both his physician and his friend. Gachet himself was an amateur painter and collector, and he encouraged Vincent to work freely without concern for convention or criticism. Vincent painted a portrait of the doctor in which Gachet leans on a table, his head resting on his hand, his eyes filled with thought. The portrait captures both the compassion and the quiet melancholy that Vincent seemed to recognize in him. Perhaps he saw in Gachet a reflection of his own struggles. The weeks that followed were some of the most productive of Vincent's entire life. He painted almost every day, sometimes completing a canvas in a single sitting. The wheat fields around Auvers became one of his favorite subjects. He painted them under shifting skies, sometimes calm and blue, sometimes dark with gathering storms. The heavy brushstrokes and bold colors gave these fields a sense of movement, as if the wind itself were part of the painting. In addition to landscapes, Vincent turned his attention to the village itself. The church at Auvers became one of his most famous works with its unusual angles and deep blue shadows. The building seems to stand apart from the earth, its walls glowing as though lit from within. There is a strange unease in the painting, as if the church is both a place of refuge and a reminder of human fragility. Despite his incredible output, Vincent's letters from this time reveal that his mind was still restless. He worried about Theo, whose health was declining and whose job was becoming more uncertain. Vincent feared that he was a financial and emotional burden on his brother. He also expressed doubts about his own work, wondering if it had any real worth. He wrote of feeling a darkness approaching even as the summer days grew longer and brighter. The landscapes from his last weeks are among the most powerful he ever created. In Wheatfield with crows, black birds swirl above a path that seems to lead nowhere under a sky thick with tension. Many have interpreted this as a symbol of his final days, though there is no proof that Vincent intended it as such. Still, the painting carries a weight of emotion that is hard to separate from the tragedy that soon followed. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into a wheat field carrying a small revolver. What happened next remains uncertain, but by evening, he had returned to the inn with a gunshot wound to his chest. He managed to climb the stairs to his room, where he was found by the innkeeper. Dr. Gachet was called, but there was little that could be done. Over the next 2 days, Vincent drifted in and out of consciousness. Theo rushed to be at his side, and was there when Vincent whispered his final words. "I wish I could go like this." Vincent van Gogh died on July 29, 1890, at the age of 37. He was buried in the small cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise, surrounded by the fields he had painted in his final months. Theo died just 6 months later and was buried beside him. Today, the two brothers lie together, their graves covered in ivy, a quiet testament to a bond that had sustained Vincent through his most difficult years. In the 70 days he spent in Auvers, Vincent created more than 70 paintings, an astonishing pace by any standard. It was as if he knew his time was short and was determined to leave behind as much as he could. The works from this period are filled with life, color, and emotion, a final surge of creativity before the silence. The time in Auvers was brief, but it holds a special place in the story of Vincent van Gogh. It was a chapter where beauty and sorrow existed side by side, where the calm of the countryside was matched by the storms within his mind. And though his life ended there, the paintings he left behind continue to speak in colors and shapes that words can never fully capture. They remind us that even in the face of darkness, the act of creation can be a kind of light. To understand the life and art of Vincent van Gogh, it is impossible to separate his story from that of his younger brother Theo. Their relationship was the single most constant thread in Vincent's turbulent life, from childhood until the very end. Theo was more than a sibling. He was Vincent's confidant supporter, and at times his only connection to the world outside his own mind. The brothers grew up in the same household in the village of Zundert, sharing the same early influences. Their father was a Protestant pastor, and their mother encouraged creativity and a love of nature. But while Vincent was restless and often misunderstood, Theo was steady, calm, and quick to make friends. Theo's nature made him ideally suited to work in the art trade, and he eventually became an art dealer in Paris. His position would later prove essential in supporting Vincent's career, even when it seemed the rest of the world had no interest in his paintings. Their bond was strengthened through the hundreds of letters they exchanged over the years. These letters reveal a depth of honesty and vulnerability rarely found between two people. Vincent shared everything with Theo: his struggles with money, his bursts of inspiration, his fears about his health, and his dreams for the future. Theo in turn responded with encouragement, practical advice, and financial assistance. He often sent Vincent paints and supplies, along with reassurances that his work mattered even if no one was buying it. This support was not without sacrifice. Theo worked long hours in a competitive business and often sent more money to Vincent than he could comfortably afford. His belief in his brother's talent was unshakable, even when others dismissed Vincent as unstable or unskilled. At times, Theo acted almost like a manager, introducing Vincent's work to other artists and dealers, trying to find a place for him in the rapidly evolving art world. Their relationship was not without its moments of tension. Vincent could be difficult, impulsive, and prone to intense emotions. There were times when his letters were filled with frustration or demands, yet Theo never turned away. He seemed to understand that Vincent's temper was part of the same passion that fueled his art, and he accepted it as part of the whole person. Theo's influence on Vincent was more than financial. He was also a crucial link between Vincent and the wider art community. It was through Theo that Vincent learned about new movements and met other artists, including the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Theo's insight into the market helped guide Vincent's experiments in style and subject matter, even if Vincent ultimately followed his own instincts rather than trends. Perhaps the most touching aspect of their bond was the way they shared each other's emotional burdens. When Vincent's mental health declined, Theo offered comfort and stability. When Theo's own health began to falter, Vincent expressed deep concern, urging his brother to rest and take care of himself. Even during his final days in Auvers, Vincent worried that his illness and inability to earn money placed too much strain on Theo's life. The end of their story is as intertwined as the rest of it. When Vincent died in July 1890, Theo was devastated. His grief was so intense that his own health rapidly declined. Just months later, Theo was suffering from advanced syphilis, a disease that had already begun to affect his body and mind. Without the purpose and connection that his brother had given him, Theo seemed to fade. He died in January 1891, only 6 months after Vincent, and was buried beside him in Auvers-sur-Oise. Today, the graves of Vincent and Theo lie side by side, covered in a blanket of green ivy. The simplicity of the site speaks to the truth of their relationship. They were two brothers bound not just by blood, but by an unbreakable faith in each other. Vincent may not have lived to see the world embrace his art, but Theo did everything he could to make sure that day would come. It is because of Theo's tireless support that so many of Vincent's works survived and were eventually recognized. Without him, Vincent might have been lost to history, known only as a troubled man who painted in obscurity. Instead, the world remembers him as one of the greatest artists of all time. And behind every canvas, every brushstroke, there is the quiet, enduring presence of a brother who believed when no one else would. The story of Vincent van Gogh cannot be told without Theo, because it was Theo who gave him the means, the encouragement, and the emotional anchor he needed to keep going. In many ways, the art we now treasure is the result of their shared journey, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and faith between two brothers whose lives were forever entwined. When Vincent van Gogh arrived in Arles in February 1888, he was chasing a dream. For years, he had longed to leave the grey skies of Northern Europe behind and find a place where the sun poured light over every surface, a place where colours seemed alive and nature was filled with warmth and energy. Arles, a small town in the south of France, promised exactly that. From the moment he stepped off the train, Vincent was struck by the difference. The landscape glowed with the golden tones of wheat fields, the rich greens of olive trees, and the deep blues of the sky. The light was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was sharp and bright, casting strong shadows and making every color stand out vividly. This brilliant light would transform his art over the next year. Vincent threw himself into painting almost as soon as he arrived. He wandered through the fields and along the banks of the Rhone River, capturing the life of the countryside. He painted blossoming orchards, rustic farmhouses, bridges, and boats. He studied the faces of local people, from farmers to cafe owners. His brush moved quickly. His colors became more daring and his compositions more expressive. In Arles, he began to develop the style that would later be recognized as uniquely his own. One of Vincent's main goals in moving to Arles was to create an artist's community. He imagined a place where painters could work together, exchange ideas, and inspire one another. To make this vision real, he rented a small yellow house near the train station. Its walls were bright and cheerful, and he hoped it would become a gathering place for creative minds. It was here in the yellow house that Vincent painted some of his most famous works. The bedrooms, the view from the windows, the chairs, and even simple everyday objects became subjects for his art. He filled the rooms with paintings to make the space feel alive and welcoming. Each canvas reflected his belief that beauty could be found in ordinary things if one only knew how to see it. Despite his excitement, Vincent was often lonely. The dream of an artist's colony seemed far away without other painters to share it. That changed when his friend Paul Gauguin agreed to join him in Arles in the autumn of 1888. Vincent was overjoyed. He prepared the yellow house with care, decorating the guest room with paintings of sunflowers as a warm welcome. Gauguin's arrival brought new energy to Vincent's work. The two men spent hours discussing art, painting side by side, and challenging each other to push their styles further. However, their time together was not without problems. Both men were strong-willed and had very different temperaments. Gauguin was more detached and strategic in his approach to painting, while Vincent was intensely emotional, pouring his feelings directly onto the canvas. Their artistic debates sometimes turned into arguments, and the pressure of living and working so closely together began to build. Outside of his relationship with Gauguin, Vincent continued to find inspiration in the people and places of Arles. He painted the night cafes with their glowing lamps and shadowy corners, capturing the mix of warmth and isolation that filled such places. He painted the star-filled sky over the Rhône, reflecting in the water. He painted workers in the fields, the quiet streets, the drawbridges, and the gardens. Each piece was a love letter to the region and its light. Vincent's health, however, began to decline as winter approached. The long hours of work, often without enough food or rest, wore him down. His mind too began to show signs of strain. The tension between him and Gauguin finally reached a breaking point in December, in an incident that would become infamous in art history. After a heated argument, Vincent experienced a mental crisis and cut part of his own ear. He delivered it to a local woman before collapsing in exhaustion and confusion. This incident led to Vincent spending time in the hospital in Arles. The local townspeople began to see him as unstable, and some even petitioned to have him removed from the neighborhood. The yellow house, which had once been a symbol of his hopes, now felt empty and uncertain. Yet despite his illness, Vincent returned to painting as soon as he could. He created some of his most remarkable works during this period, proof of how deeply art was tied to his sense of purpose. Life in Arles had brought Vincent both his brightest and darkest days. It gave him the sunflowers, the orchards, the starry nights, and the glowing landscapes that would define his legacy. It also brought him the deep loneliness, the struggles with mental illness, and the breakdown of his friendship with Gauguin. Even with the hardships, Vincent often spoke of Arles with affection in his letters to Theo. The colors, the light, and the simple rural life had been exactly what he had hoped for when he first set out from Paris. His time there, though brief, had transformed his art forever. It was in Arles that Vincent came closest to realizing the vision he had for his work, a vision filled with light color and the beauty of everyday life. When Paul Gauguin stepped off the train in Arles in October 1888, Vincent van Gogh was waiting for him with excitement. Vincent had spent months preparing for this moment. He had dreamed of building an artist's community in the Yellow House, and Gauguin was to be its first member. To welcome him, Vincent had decorated the guest room with his now famous paintings of sunflowers, believing their bright yellows would bring warmth and cheer. The two men began working together almost immediately. They painted the same subjects, but in their own distinct styles. Vincent's work was bursting with color and emotion, while Gauguin's approach was more deliberate and controlled. At first, the difference inspired them. Each could see new possibilities in the other's way of thinking. They discussed art for hours, sometimes late into the night, exploring questions about color, composition, and the role of imagination. The companionship was exactly what Vincent had hoped for after months of working alone. he felt energized and more determined than ever to create. The streets, fields, and cafes of Arles became their shared studio. They painted side by side in orchards under the bright sun or in dimly lit cafes at night. Gauguin often focused on the people around them, while Vincent poured his energy into landscapes and still lifes. But as the weeks passed, their differences began to cause tension. Gauguin was more reserved and liked to plan his paintings carefully. He sometimes criticized Vincent for working too quickly and letting emotion lead the way. Vincent, on the other hand, found Gauguin's method too cold. He believed art should come from the heart, without being overthought. Their conversations, which had once been exciting, began to feel like arguments. Life in the Yellow House grew more difficult. Gauguin had a calm and independent personality and preferred to spend time alone. Vincent needed constant discussion and connection. Gauguin felt Vincent's intensity was exhausting, while Vincent worried that Gauguin was becoming distant. Both were passionate artists, but their temperaments were like oil and water. Despite the growing strain, they still produced some of their finest work. During this time, Gauguin painted scenes of local life in bold colors with strong outlines. Vincent continued to explore new ways of using color to express emotion. His famous painting, The Night Cafe, came from this period, capturing the warmth and loneliness of a small bar lit by gas lamps. He also painted landscapes such as the Red Vineyard and portraits of local people. Their differences reached a breaking point in December. One evening, after a long day filled with disagreements, Gauguin decided to go for a walk. Vincent followed him in a highly agitated state. Gauguin later said that Vincent approached him holding a razor, but then turned away. Instead of harming Gauguin, Vincent returned to the Yellow House, where he suffered a severe mental crisis. In that moment of confusion and distress, he cut off part of his own ear and later gave it to a woman who worked at a nearby brothel. This shocking act left Vincent physically and emotionally drained. He was taken to the hospital, where he stayed for several days. Gauguin left Arles soon after, unable to continue living and working with him. The dream of the artist's community collapsed with his departure. When Vincent was released from the hospital, he returned to the Yellow House. But the atmosphere had changed. The rooms felt empty without Gauguin, and the local people had begun to treat Vincent with suspicion. Many saw him as unstable and dangerous. Some even signed a petition to have him removed from the neighborhood. Yet Vincent continued to paint. The act of putting brush to canvas remained his only way of making sense of the world around him. He painted self-portraits, perhaps as a way to face himself in a time of turmoil. He painted the hospital ward, the gardens, the nearby river, and the winter skies over Arles. His colors remained bright, even in the darkest times, a sign of his deep attachment to beauty. The arrival of Gauguin had brought Vincent moments of joy and a burst of creative energy. But it had also led to conflict, heartbreak, and the beginning of more serious struggles with his mental health. Looking back, Vincent still valued the experience. In letters to his brother Theo, he spoke of the lessons he had learned from Gauguin and the paintings they had inspired. For Vincent, the time with Gauguin in Arles was both a high point and a turning point. It showed him the possibilities of collaboration, but also the challenges of living and working so closely with another artist. It strengthened his commitment to painting as a deeply personal expression of his inner life, even if it meant walking a path alone. After Gauguin left, Vincent found himself truly alone in the Yellow House. The once lively rooms now felt silent and heavy with emptiness. The walls still displayed the sunflower paintings he had made to welcome his friend, but now they seemed to watch over him as reminders of what had been lost. The dream of building a community of artists had ended, and Vincent had to face the reality that he might be the only one willing to live it. The people of Arles were uneasy around him. News of his breakdown had spread quickly, and rumors made the story even more dramatic than it had been. Some townspeople avoided him entirely. Others whispered when he passed in the street. The brothel where he had once been a familiar face. now kept its distance. The market sellers, who had once greeted him with a smile, now turned away. His reputation as an unstable outsider grew. Despite this, Vincent returned to painting with determination. It was his way of fighting the darkness closing in on him. His subjects were often familiar sights: the streets of Arles, the surrounding fields, the gardens near the hospital. He also painted himself again and again. His self-portraits from this time show a man both fragile and fierce. His eyes are intense, his colours bold, as if he were holding on to life through the strength of his art. But the loneliness weighed heavily on him. Without the companionship of another artist, the days seemed longer. He tried to fill them with work, rising early to catch the morning light and painting until the sun set. Sometimes he would walk into the countryside with his easel and canvas, looking for the right spot to capture the changing seasons. In winter, he painted bare trees against pale skies. In early spring, he painted blossoms returning to the orchards. The yellow house itself became both a refuge and a prison. He had decorated it with bright furniture and colourful paintings to keep his spirits up. But at night, the empty rooms seemed to echo with silence. He wrote letters to his brother Theo almost daily, describing his work and his thoughts. Theo's replies brought comfort, but the physical distance between them was hard to bear. Theo was deeply worried about him. He knew Vincent was fragile, and living in isolation could make his condition worse. He urged Vincent to consider spending more time in the company of others, perhaps even returning to Paris. Vincent resisted. He believed that Arles, with its light and colours, was still the best place for his work. He wanted to prove that he could stand on his own, even without Gauguin. But as the weeks passed, his mental health became more unstable. He had moments of clarity when he could paint with incredible focus, followed by periods of confusion and exhaustion. During one of these low points, the townspeople petitioned to have him removed from the Yellow House, claiming he was a danger to himself and others. The police visited and questioned him, but for a time, he was allowed to stay. Vincent tried to rebuild some connection with the community. He offered to paint portraits for local people and gave small paintings as gifts. He visited familiar places like the Café de la Gare, where he had once painted the famous night scene. But while some accepted his presence, others continued to keep their distance. The sense of being an outsider never left him. His work during this period showed both his resilience and his struggle. The colours remained vivid, as if he refused to let the world turn grey even when he felt low. He painted the riverbanks in shimmering blues, the fields in golden yellows, the blossoming trees in soft pinks. His brushstrokes carried a sense of urgency, as though he knew time might be running short. Still, there were days when he could not bring himself to paint. The silence of the house pressed on him. The absence of conversation made the nights longer. In letters to Theo, he admitted feeling trapped between his need to create and the weight of his own mind. He longed for connection, yet feared the pain it might bring after the loss of Gauguin. The Yellow House stood as both a symbol of his greatest hopes and his deepest disappointments. It was here that he had dreamed of an artist's haven, and here that the dream had fallen apart. It was here he had painted some of his most powerful works, and here that he had faced some of his darkest moments. The rooms were filled with the smell of oil paint and turpentine, the floors spattered with traces of his labour, each mark telling a story. By the spring of 1889, Vincent began to realise that he could not go on like this. He was physically exhausted, mentally fragile, and increasingly cut off from the people around him. He still loved the light of Arles, but it could no longer shield him from his inner storms. Theo suggested that he enter a place where he could receive care while continuing to paint. The idea frightened Vincent, but he also knew he might need it. The time alone in the Yellow House had shown him both the strength of his artistic spirit and the limits of his endurance. He had created beauty in the face of isolation, but the cost had been high. The paintings from this period are full of colour, yet beneath the surface, they carry the weight of a man struggling to hold himself together alone in the Yellow House. Vincent had learned that even the brightest light cannot fully chase away the shadows within. In May of 1889, Vincent made the difficult decision to leave Arles and admit himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. This was not an easy choice for him. He feared losing his freedom, and he worried that being in an institution might stifle his ability to paint. But after months of emotional strain, isolation, and unpredictable moods, he understood that he needed a place where he could find some stability. Saint-Paul-de-Moselle was a former monastery surrounded by gardens, olive groves, and fields of wheat. Its thick stone walls and heavy wooden doors gave the place a quiet and almost timeless atmosphere. The asylum was run by doctors and nuns who cared for patients suffering from various mental illnesses. The setting was peaceful, but it was also closed off from the outside world. Vincent now lived among men who struggled with their minds just as he did. His room was small with a simple bed, a wooden chair, and a window that overlooked the garden. The view from that window would soon become one of his greatest inspirations. In the early mornings, Vincent would stand there watching the sun rise over the hills and fields. The changing colors of dawn stirred something deep in him. He began sketching almost immediately and soon asked the staff if he could paint. They agreed, as long as he remained supervised during certain times. At first, his condition was unstable. He experienced sudden bursts of confusion and exhaustion. Sometimes he could not work at all. On other days, he painted with intense focus for hours without stopping. Painting became a form of therapy for him, a way to quiet his restless mind and give his emotions shape and color. The doctors noticed that when he was painting, he appeared calmer and more grounded. The gardens of the asylum became his outdoor studio. He painted the irises in brilliant blues, the olive trees twisted and silver under the Provençal sun, and the cypress trees rising like dark flames into the sky. He often worked quickly, laying down thick, energetic brushstrokes, as though the act of painting itself kept him steady. His canvases from this period are filled with movement and life, even though he was living in a place where most days were quiet and repetitive. One of his most famous works from Saint-Rémy came from looking out of his bedroom window before dawn. In the stillness of night, he saw a vast sky swirling with light and shadow. The moon glowed, and the stars shimmered like sparks of fire. This vision became the Starry Night, a painting that captured both the turbulence and beauty of his inner world. The swirling sky, the sleeping village, and the towering cypress all carried the mark of a man who felt deeply and saw the world in ways others could not. Life in the asylum followed a routine. The patients woke early, had simple meals, and spent much of the day in the gardens or walking in the surrounding fields. Some were silent, withdrawn into their own thoughts. Others were restless or loud. Vincent kept mostly to himself, but he observed those around him closely. In letters to Theo, he described the kindness of some patients, the sadness of others, and the small details of daily life in the institution. Though the asylum was a place of safety, it was also confining. Vincent missed the freedom of wandering the countryside whenever he wished. The rules meant he could not leave without permission, and even when allowed to go out, he was usually accompanied by a staff member. Till he made the most of these moments, often walking to nearby fields to paint the golden wheat under the summer sun. Theo supported him throughout this time, sending money supplies and constant encouragement. In his letters, Vincent expressed gratitude, but also admitted his fears. He worried that people would think he was completely broken and no longer capable of living a normal life. Yet his paintings told a different story. They showed a mind still capable of extraordinary vision and a heart still deeply connected to the beauty of the world. As the months passed, his health improved slightly, though he still suffered episodes of mental distress. Sometimes he would stop painting altogether when the strain became too much, but he always returned to it as soon as he could. The staff recognized the positive effect art had on him and gave him more freedom to work. When he was well, he painted every day, producing landscapes, portraits, and still lifes that remain among his most powerful creations. The cypress trees especially fascinated him. He saw them not as mere plants, but as symbols of endurance. Their dark shapes stood tall against the changing skies, sometimes bending in the wind, yet never breaking. He painted them again and again, capturing their movement and strength. Perhaps in them, he saw a reflection of his own struggle to remain upright in the face of life's storms. The year at Saint-Remy was a mix of calm and turbulence. There were peaceful days when he could lose himself in the rhythm of his brush, and there were darker times when his thoughts became overwhelming. Yet through it all, his dedication to painting never wavered. He once wrote to Theo that even in the depths of suffering, there was still a duty to create something beautiful, something that could speak to others long after the pain had passed. By the end of 1889, Vincent had produced more than 100 paintings from his time in the asylum. His work from Saint-Remy is filled with emotion, but also with a deep connection to nature. The olive trees, the blooming flowers, the starry skies, all seem to carry his spirit within them. Though he was behind walls, he had found a way to make the world outside live on his canvas. Living in the asylum taught him that even in places of confinement there could be freedom in creativity. It showed him that art could be both a lifeline and a form of healing. The quiet gardens and the steady routines gave him space to recover, while the landscapes around Saint-Remy gave him endless inspiration. And though he still wrestled with his mind, he left behind paintings that proved his spirit was still unbroken. While living at the Saint Paul de Mausolée asylum, Vincent's main connection to the outside world came through his letters to Theo and a few trusted friends. These letters were more than simple updates on his health. They were windows into his thoughts, his feelings, and his creative process. In them, he shared his struggles with mental illness, his hopes for recovery, and his dreams for his art. He wrote in a way that was both deeply personal and unflinchingly honest. Vincent often described the details of his surroundings to Theo, as if he wanted his brother to see what he saw. He wrote about the gardens filled with irises, the olive groves shimmering under the sun, and the distant mountains that framed the horizon. These letters were not just reports. They were almost like painted pictures made with words. He spoke about the light in the mornings, and how the shadows moved through the day, and about the colors that seemed to shift with each hour. He also wrote about the routines of the asylum and the other patients living there. Some were gentle and quiet, while others were restless and loud. Vincent described them without judgment, noting the humanity in each person. He seemed to take comfort in knowing he was not alone in his struggles, though he still felt a deep sense of isolation from the wider world. One of the recurring themes in his letters was his gratitude to Theo. He knew that without his brother's financial and emotional support, he would not have been able to keep painting. Theo sent him money for art supplies, and sometimes even shipped canvases and paints directly to Saint-Remy. Vincent was always careful to let him know how much this meant to him. He thanked Theo, not only for the materials, but for believing in his talent, when so many others had doubted him. In his letters, Vincent also shared his thoughts on other artists. He spoke about the works of Jean-François Millet, Eugène Delacroix, and Paul Gauguin, comparing their techniques to his own. He often explained the choices he made in his paintings, why he used certain colors or brushstrokes, and what emotions he hoped to capture. It was as if he was inviting Theo into his studio, letting him stand beside the easel and watch each painting come to life. But there was another side to these letters, a darker and more vulnerable one. Vincent sometimes confessed his fears about the future. He worried that his illness would return more severely, that his work would never be recognized, or that he would become a burden to his family. At times, he doubted his worth as both an artist and a person. These moments of despair were painful for Theo to read, yet they also revealed the depth of Vincent's self-awareness. Despite his struggles, he rarely allowed despair to fully silence his creative spirit. He often wrote about new ideas for paintings, even on days when he was too unwell to hold a brush. He described the colors he wanted to use, the scenes he wanted to capture, and the emotions he hoped to convey. Sometimes these ideas stayed in his letters, never making it to canvas, but they were proof that his mind was still alive with imagination. One of the most touching parts of his correspondence from this time was his way of finding beauty even in limitation. He could not travel freely as he once had, but he learned to see the world within the asylum walls. The gardens became endless landscapes in his mind. Each flower, each tree, each patch of sky was a potential subject for a painting. In his letters, he urged Theo to understand that beauty could be found anywhere if one looked closely enough. Vincent also reflected on the nature of suffering in these letters. He seemed to believe that pain could deepen a person's ability to see and create. In one letter he wrote that a storm in the mind could sometimes make the colors of life appear more vivid. That belief did not erase his suffering, but it gave him a way to make sense of it. To him, art was not just a profession, it was a lifeline, something that could transform hardship into meaning. While living at the St. Paul de Mausolée asylum, Vincent's main connection to the outside world came through his letters to Theo and a few trusted friends. These letters were more than simple updates on his health. They were windows into his thoughts, his feelings, and his creative process. In them, he shared his struggles with mental illness, his hopes for recovery, and his dreams for his art. He wrote in a way that was both deeply personal and unflinchingly honest. Vincent often described the details of his surroundings to Theo, as if he wanted his brother to see what he saw. He wrote about the gardens filled with irises, the olive groves shimmering under the sun, and the distant mountains that framed the horizon. These letters were not just reports, they were almost like painted pictures made with words. He spoke about the light in the mornings, and how the shadows moved through the day, and about the colors that seemed to shift with each hour. He also wrote about the routines of the asylum and the other patients living there. Some were gentle and quiet, while others were restless and loud. Vincent described them without judgment, noting the humanity in each person. He seemed to take comfort in knowing he was not alone in his struggles, though he still felt a deep sense of isolation from the wider world. One of the recurring themes in his letters was his gratitude to Theo. He knew that without his brother's financial and emotional support, he would not have been able to keep painting. Theo sent him money for art supplies, and sometimes even shipped canvases and paints directly to Saint-Remy. Vincent was always careful to let him know how much this meant to him. He thanked Theo, not only for the materials, but for believing in his talent, when so many others had doubted him. In his letters, Vincent also shared his thoughts on other artists. He spoke about the works of Jean-François Millet, Eugène Delacroix, and Paul Gauguin, comparing their techniques to his own. He often explained the choices he made in his paintings, why he used certain colors or brushstrokes, and what emotions he hoped to capture. It was as if he was inviting Theo into his studio, letting him stand beside the easel and watch each painting come to life. But there was another side to these letters, a darker and more vulnerable one. Vincent sometimes confessed his fears about the future. He worried that his illness would return more severely, that his work would never be recognized, or that he would become a burden to his family. At times, he doubted his worth as both an artist and a person. These moments of despair were painful for Theo to read, yet they also revealed the depth of Vincent's self-awareness. Despite his struggles, he rarely allowed despair to fully silence his creative spirit. He often wrote about new ideas for paintings, even on days when he was too unwell to hold a brush. He described the colors he wanted to use, the scenes he wanted to capture, and the emotions he hoped to convey. Sometimes these ideas stayed in his letters, never making it to canvas, but they were proof that his mind was still alive with imagination. One of the most touching parts of his correspondence from this time was his way of finding beauty even in limitation. He could not travel freely as he once had, but he learned to see the world within the asylum walls. The gardens became endless landscapes in his mind. Each flower, each tree, each patch of sky was a potential subject for a painting. In his letters, he urged Theo to understand that beauty could be found anywhere if one looked closely enough. Vincent also reflected on the nature of suffering in these letters. He seemed to believe that pain could deepen a person's ability to see and create. In one letter he wrote that a storm in the mind could sometimes make the colors of life appear more vivid. That belief did not erase his suffering, but it gave him a way to make sense of it. To him, art was not just a profession, it was a lifeline, something that could transform hardship into meaning. During his time at Saint-Remy, Vincent often found himself drawn to the gardens just outside the asylum walls. These gardens were a place of refuge for him, a space where he could feel a little more freedom, even though he was still confined. He spent hours there studying the plants and the way the light moved over them. He noticed how the colors shifted from morning to evening, and how the wind made the leaves and petals dance. One of his favorite subjects was the iris. These flowers with their bold purple petals and sharp green leaves captured his imagination. The irises grew in thick clusters, bending gently in the breeze. Vincent studied each curve and shadow carefully. When he painted them, he exaggerated the colors, making the purples richer and the greens more vibrant. He wanted to show the life and energy he saw in them, not just their physical form. Painting the irises seemed to bring him a sense of calm. Their beauty was simple, yet endless in variation. Each flower was slightly different, and the more he looked, the more details he noticed. Sometimes he painted them alone, against a background of soft earth tones, and other times he set them in a field or a garden scene. Every time the irises seemed to take on a different mood. Another subject that fascinated him was the olive tree. The asylum was surrounded by olive groves, their twisted trunks and silvery leaves standing against the bright blue sky. Vincent loved the way the trees seemed both ancient and alive. Their shapes were irregular and unpredictable, almost like figures frozen in motion. He often spoke of them in his letters to Theo, describing how their branches caught the sunlight or cast long shadows in the late afternoon. When Vincent painted the olive trees, he did not try to make them perfect or symmetrical. Instead, he embraced their wildness. He used thick brushstrokes to give the trees texture and energy. The leaves were painted in shifting shades of green and silver, and the ground beneath them was alive with touches of yellow and gold. Sometimes he added figures of workers in the groves bending to tend the trees or resting in the shade. But the trees themselves always felt like the true characters of the scene. The irises and the olive trees were more than just beautiful subjects for Vincent. They were symbols of life, resilience, and change. The irises bloomed brightly each spring, then faded away. The olive trees stood year after year, weathering the seasons and the storms. In a way, Vincent seemed to find a reflection of himself in both. The irises spoke to the fragile moments of beauty and joy, while the olive trees represented endurance and survival. In the gardens, he also painted other plants and flowers, but the irises and olive trees appeared again and again in his work, as if he could not quite let them go. Each new painting was a chance to see them in a different light or from a new angle. Sometimes he worked quickly, capturing the energy of the moment, and other times he slowed down, studying the smallest details before putting his brush to the canvas. For Vincent, these subjects were also a way to practice and experiment. He played with color, pushing it beyond what he saw in reality. He deepened the shadows, added brighter highlights, and used unexpected combinations to create harmony and contrast. He was not trying to copy nature exactly. Instead, he was trying to capture its spirit, its rhythm, and its mood. The patients and staff at the asylum often saw him working in the gardens. Sometimes they would stop to watch, and other times they would leave him alone, knowing he was lost in his work. The staff understood that painting was part of his healing, even if they did not fully understand his methods. Vincent did not seem to mind the occasional audience, but he preferred to work quietly, letting the scene guide his hand. Even on days when he was too unwell to venture far, he could often see the gardens from his window. The sight of the irises or the olive groves would spark ideas for new paintings. He would sketch them from memory or jot down notes about the colors and shapes so he could work on them later. These moments reminded him that even when his body or mind felt trapped, his imagination could still move freely. In many ways, the irises and olive trees became a record of his time at Saint-Rémy. Looking at those paintings now one can see not just plants, but moods. The vibrant, swirling brushstrokes in some works suggest days of energy and clarity, while the softer, more subdued tones in others hint at quieter or more difficult times. Through these works, Vincent left a visual diary of his inner life. As his months in the asylum went on, his connection to the gardens deepened. He no longer saw the plants as just subjects, but as companions in a shared space. Their changes marked the passing of time. The first buds of the irises told him spring had come. The shifting light on the olive trees showed him the approach of evening, in a place where every day could feel the same. These changes mattered. Vincent sometimes wondered in his letters whether the beauty he saw in these gardens would mean anything to others. He hoped that his paintings would help people see the same vibrancy and movement that he experienced. He believed that art could make people look more closely at the world around them and notice the details they might otherwise overlook. The irises and olive trees were never grand or famous landscapes. They were small pieces of the natural world, tucked away in the quiet corners of Provence. But in Vincent's eyes, they were worth as much attention as any grand scene. He treated them with the same care and devotion he might have given to a vast mountain view or a busy city street. By focusing on these humble subjects, he showed that beauty is not only found in extraordinary places, it can live in the curve of a petal, in the bend of a branch, or in the play of sunlight on leaves. Perhaps that is why these paintings continue to feel alive. They carry not only the image of a plant or tree, but the way Vincent experienced them in a specific moment in time when he finally left. Saint-Rémy, these gardens remained in his mind. He carried their colours and forms with him, and they continue to appear in his later work. The irises and olive trees were more than just part of his surroundings. They had become part of his vision as an artist and part of his personal story. A reminder that even in confinement and struggle, there could be beauty worth capturing. One of the most famous paintings Vincent created during his time at Saint-Rémy is The Starry Night. This painting has become one of the most recognized and celebrated works in the history of art. Yet when Vincent painted it, he was not thinking about fame or success. He was simply trying to capture the feeling of the night sky as he experienced it from his room in the asylum. The idea for the starry night came from the view outside his window. In the early mornings or late at night, Vincent would look out and see the hills of Provence under a deep blue sky. The stars seemed larger and brighter than he had ever noticed before, and the moon cast a soft glow over the landscape. From his vantage point, he could see cypress trees rising like dark flames against the horizon and the quiet village in the distance. Rather than paint the scene exactly as it appeared, Vincent decided to let his imagination shape it. He transformed the stillness of the night into something alive and full of movement. The sky in the starry night is not a flat backdrop. Instead, it is a swirling river of blues and yellows that seems to roll and twist across the canvas. The stars burn like golden orbs, surrounded by halos of light. The moon glows with the same intensity as the brightest star. The cypress tree in the foreground rises tall and dark, almost touching the sky. Its sharp curves mirror the shapes of the swirling clouds above. The village below is painted with calmer, more stable lines, which creates a contrast between the quiet earth and the restless heavens. The church steeple points upward, as if trying to connect the two worlds. What makes the starry night so striking is not only the beauty of the scene, but the emotion it carries. The painting feels like a dream, something both real and imagined. The energy of the swirling sky could reflect Vincent's own restless thoughts, while the peaceful village may have represented a longing for stability and calm. The balance between these two elements makes the work powerful and deeply human. In his letters to Theo, Vincent spoke about his fascination with the night sky. He wrote about how he felt that looking at the stars was like dreaming or imagining life beyond the world we know. He often compared the night to a great mystery, something vast and beautiful that could never be fully understood. The starry night was his way of sharing that feeling on canvas. When he worked on this painting, Vincent applied his brushstrokes in thick, sweeping motions. The texture of the paint itself added movement and depth to the image. This technique, known as impasto, allowed the paint to catch the light in different ways, making the surface of the canvas almost as dynamic as the scene it portrayed. At the time, the Starry Night did not receive much praise from the small circle of people who saw it. Some even found it strange or unsettling because it did not follow traditional rules of perspective and realism. But Vincent was not concerned with following rules. He wanted to paint how the night felt rather than how it looked. His bold use of color and his willingness to distort shapes for the sake of emotion were part of what made his work unique. The painting was created during a period when Vincent was struggling with his mental health, yet it does not feel hopeless. While there is turbulence in the sky, there is also light everywhere. Every star, every swirl, every stroke of yellow seems to pulse with life. This mix of chaos and beauty is perhaps why the painting continues to move people today. Many art historians have tried to interpret the Starry Night. Some see it as a spiritual work, others as a reflection of Vincent's inner turmoil, and still others as an experiment in color and form. Perhaps it is all of these at once. Vincent himself did not leave a clear explanation, and maybe that is part of the magic. The painting speaks differently to each person who sees it. For Vincent, the act of painting it may have been a way to process his emotions. At the asylum, he often felt trapped, but the sky above was limitless. The idea that he could capture even a fraction of that vastness on a small canvas must have felt like a kind of freedom. It was a reminder that there was a world beyond his walls and that his art could reach it even if he could not. The cypress tree in the painting is another element worth noticing. In Provence, these trees are often found in cemeteries and are associated with death. But for Vincent, they were not only symbols of endings, they were also a link between earth and sky, a bridge between the living world and something greater. The way the cypress in the Starry Night cuts through the composition gives the scene a sense of connection and unity. The village in the painting is calm and still, yet it was not something Vincent could see from his window. He invented it from memory and imagination, blending elements of the small towns he had visited in the past. This shows how much of the painting was created from feeling rather than direct observation. It was a world shaped by memory, dream, and emotion over time. The Starry Night became more than just a painting. It became a symbol of the beauty that can emerge from struggle. The swirling sky, the glowing stars, and the quiet village all work together to tell a story without words. A story about longing, about finding light in darkness, and about seeing the world in a way that is deeply personal. When people look at the Starry Night today, they often feel a sense of wonder. It draws them in and makes them look closer. The more they look, the more they see the subtle shifts in color, the delicate balance between chaos and peace, the human hand behind every brushstroke. It is as if Vincent is still speaking through the paint, inviting the viewer to share in his vision. Even though Vincent did not live to see the painting celebrated, it stands now as one of his greatest achievements. It shows the courage it takes to paint not just what is in front of you, but what is inside you. The Starry Night captures a feeling that words cannot fully describe, and that is why it continues to inspire people around the world. For Vincent, creating the Starry Night was more than making a beautiful image. It was a way of reaching for something beyond himself, a way of holding on to hope in a time of uncertainty. The painting remains a reminder that even in moments of darkness there can be light, and that beauty can be found in the most unexpected places. Throughout his life, Vincent relied heavily on his younger brother Theo for emotional support, financial help, and encouragement. Their relationship was one of deep loyalty and love. And it is thanks to the hundreds of letters Vincent wrote to Theo that we understand so much about his thoughts, feelings, and struggles. These letters are not just family correspondence. They are a record of an artist's inner world. Vincent began writing to Theo when they were both young men, and the exchange continued for nearly 2 decades. In his letters, Vincent shared everything from his daily routines to his artistic ideas and personal worries. He described the weather, the colors of the landscape, and the people he met with the same care and detail that he used in his paintings. Each letter was a mixture of practical updates and poetic reflections. Theo was more than just a brother. He was Vincent's closest friend and confidant. He worked as an art dealer in Paris and often sent Vincent money and supplies so that he could keep painting. Without Theo's steady support, Vincent might not have been able to create the hundreds of works that he produced in just a few short years. The letters show how much Vincent depended on this bond. They also reveal that Theo truly believed in his brother's talent, even when almost no one else did. In many of his letters, Vincent expressed his frustrations about the art world. He was aware that his style was different from what was popular at the time, and he often worried about never selling a painting till Theo encouraged him to keep going, reminding him that his work mattered and that success was not always immediate. These words kept Vincent going during times when his confidence was at its lowest. Vincent's letters were also a place where he explored his ideas about art. He wrote about his love for bold colors, his belief in painting from life, and his desire to express emotion through every brushstroke. He often compared painting to writing a story, with each canvas telling its own tale. He saw himself as part of a larger tradition of artists, but also as someone forging his own unique path. The emotional openness of these letters makes them unlike most artists' writings. Vincent did not hide his fears or his struggles with mental health. He spoke honestly about feeling lonely, about battling depression, and about his time in hospitals and asylums. Yet he also wrote with great tenderness and warmth, especially when describing the beauty of nature or the comfort of Theo's friendship. Sometimes the letters included small sketches of the paintings Vincent was working on. This allowed Theo to see his progress and gave him a glimpse into the creative process. These little drawings are now considered artworks in their own right, and they show how deeply connected Vincent's writing and painting were to each other. One of the most touching parts of the correspondence is the way Vincent constantly expressed gratitude to Theo. Even when he had little to offer in return, he wrote about how much Theo's kindness meant to him. He understood the sacrifices Theo was making and never took them for granted. In many ways, Theo's faith in him became the foundation on which Vincent built his artistic courage. The letters also reveal that Vincent was a man of deep thought and reflection. He often quoted books he had read, discussed ideas from philosophy and religion, and connected these ideas to his art. He was curious about everything and used his writing as a way to think through the big questions of life. Why are we here? What is the purpose of beauty? How can art speak to the soul? These questions shaped not only his letters, but also his paintings. In his final years, the letters took on an even more emotional tone. Vincent's health was fragile, and he was keenly aware of the passing of time. Yet even then, he continued to share his hopes and his visions for future work. He spoke of wanting to paint more landscapes, to explore new colors, and to keep pushing himself as an artist. He never stopped dreaming, even when the world around him seemed uncertain. Theo kept every one of Vincent's letters after his death, and they became one of the most important records of his life. Without them, much of what we know about Vincent's thoughts, his struggles, and his artistic philosophy would have been lost. They show that he was not only a painter of great vision, but also a writer of deep sensitivity. The letters between Vincent and Theo remind us that behind every artist, there are often people who quietly make the work possible. While Vincent's name is now known around the world, Theo's role is sometimes overlooked. Yet without his support and encouragement, the story of Vincent van Gogh might have been very different. Their bond stands as a testament to the power of love and belief in another person. When we read these letters today, it is as if Vincent is speaking directly to us. We can hear the urgency in his voice, the joy he felt when a painting went well, and the despair when things seemed hopeless. We can see how much he cared about capturing the truth of the world around him, and how deeply he valued the people who stood by him. In the end, the story of Vincent and Theo is not just about art. It is about family loyalty and the ways in which one person's faith can help another achieve something extraordinary. The letters are a bridge across time, allowing us to step into the mind of one of history's most beloved artists and to understand the human heart behind the paintings. After the crisis in Arles, Vincent's health had reached a breaking point. He realized that he could no longer live and work without medical supervision. And so in May of 1889, he made the decision to voluntarily admit himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole Asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. This old monastery turned hospital was surrounded by fields, olive groves and gardens. It offered both the quiet he needed to recover and the landscapes that would inspire some of his most powerful works. Life in Saint-Rémy was a mix of structure and isolation. Vincent had his own small room with a barred window, but he was allowed to paint in the gardens and the surrounding countryside. When he was well enough, the hospital staff recognized his need to work and gave him a separate room to use as a studio. This simple act of kindness meant a great deal to him. Painting was not only his passion, but also a form of therapy. It gave him a way to channel the chaos in his mind into something beautiful and meaningful. Vincent described the asylum in his letters to Theo. He spoke of the high stone walls, the quiet corridors, and the sounds of other patients. Some were calm and withdrawn, while others were restless or in distress. Life there was not always peaceful, but it was safer than the turmoil he had experienced in Arles. He often mentioned the gardens where he spent hours studying the flowers and trees and painting them in his bold, vibrant style. One of the most striking things about Vincent's time in Saint-Rémy is that even during periods of illness, he created some of his most famous works. It was here that he painted the Starry Night, perhaps his best-known masterpiece. The swirling sky, the bright moon, and the dark silhouette of the cypress tree were born out of his view from the asylum window. While he could not leave the grounds without permission, he painted what he saw with imagination and emotional intensity, turning the world outside his window into a vision of movement and light. But life in Saint-Rémy was not without its challenges. Vincent's mental health continued to be fragile. He experienced severe episodes that left him unable to work for weeks at a time. During these periods, he felt trapped and frustrated, knowing that his illness could steal away his ability to paint at any moment. Yet when he regained his strength, he returned to his canvases with renewed determination, producing still lifes, portraits, and landscapes at a remarkable pace. Theo remained a constant source of encouragement and support. He visited when he could and continued to send supplies and letters in their correspondence. Vincent wrote about his fears and doubts, but also about his excitement for new ideas. He experimented with different subjects, from the flowering almond branches that symbolized hope to the dark cypress trees that stood like flames against the sky. These paintings were more than just images. They were reflections of his inner state, sometimes calm and full of light, other times turbulent and heavy. Vincent also copied works by other artists while in Saint-Rémy, including pieces by Jean-François Millet. He admired Millet's ability to capture the dignity of rural life, and by reinterpreting these works in his own style, Vincent found comfort and inspiration. Copying was not a sign of lacking ideas, but a way for him to learn and to stay connected to the wider world of art while confined in the asylum. Despite the beauty he created, there were moments when Vincent felt deeply lonely. He missed the freedom of wandering through villages and fields, and he longed for human connection beyond the hospital walls. The other patients were not always able to interact with him in meaningful ways, and visits from Theo were too rare. He often wrote about wanting to leave, yet he understood that he still needed care. Over the course of his year in Saint-Rémy, Vincent produced more than 150 paintings. This is an extraordinary number given the limitations of his health. Each work carries traces of both his suffering and his resilience. The heavy brushstrokes, the intense colors, and the emotional energy in these paintings show a man who was constantly wrestling with himself, yet refusing to give up. The asylum also gave Vincent a chance to observe the changing seasons. He painted the fields in spring, covered with wildflowers, the heat of summer with its golden wheat, and the cool tones of autumn and winter. Nature was always a source of comfort for him, and even in confinement, he found ways to connect to it. His art became a bridge between his inner world and the natural beauty he saw around him. However, by May of 1890, Vincent and Theo agreed that it was time for him to leave Saint-Rémy. His health had improved enough for him to try living outside the asylum, though they both knew that his struggles were far from over. Vincent's year in Saint-Rémy had been a period of both great hardship and incredible artistic achievement. It proved that even in the midst of suffering, he could create works of lasting beauty. This chapter of his life reminds us that art can be a powerful force for survival. It was not just a career for Vincent, but a lifeline, something that kept him grounded and gave him purpose when everything else felt uncertain. His time in Saint-Rémy is a testament to the way creativity can coexist with pain, and how beauty can emerge even from the darkest places. After leaving Saint-Rémy, Vincent travelled north to the small village of Auvers-sur-Oise in May of 1890. The move was arranged by Theo, who wanted his brother to be closer to Paris, but still in a peaceful countryside setting. Auvers was known as a place where artists could find inspiration and tranquility. It was surrounded by wheat fields, rivers, and charming rural streets. And it was home to Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician with a special interest in treating artists and those suffering from mental illness. Dr. Gachet was himself an amateur painter and a supporter of the Impressionists. Theo believed he would be a good influence on Vincent. The doctor's home was filled with artworks, and he welcomed Vincent warmly, encouraging him to focus on painting as a way to maintain his stability. Gachet had a deep sympathy for his patients, and his artistic sensibilities meant he could understand Vincent's struggles in a way few others could. Vincent quickly settled into a small room at the Ravou Inn, a simple lodging in the heart of Auvers. He wasted no time getting to work. The countryside offered him endless inspiration. He painted the rolling wheat fields dotted with red poppies, the winding roads leading into the village, and the old thatched cottages with their weathered walls. His brush moved with urgency, as if he knew his time was limited. In just over 2 months, he produced more than 70 paintings, an extraordinary burst of creativity. One of the most famous works from this period is Portrait of Dr. Gachet. The painting captures the doctor leaning on a table, with his head resting on his hand. His face looks thoughtful and melancholy, the background filled with foxglove flowers, which Gachet used as a herbal remedy. This portrait is one of Vincent's most emotional works, showing both his admiration for the doctor and his awareness of the sadness that lingered in them both. Vincent also painted the church at Auvers, a striking image with deep blues and swirling lines. The building seems to stand between light and shadow, much like Vincent himself in those days, torn between hope and despair. His wheat field paintings from Auvers are particularly powerful. Often they feature stormy skies or crows flying overhead, hinting at a growing restlessness in his mind. These works are full of movement, as if the earth itself is alive and unsettled. Life in Auvers was calmer than in Arles or Saint-Rémy. Vincent spent his mornings and afternoons painting outdoors, returning to the inn in the evenings to write letters or rest. Yet beneath this peaceful routine, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. He worried about Theo's health. Theo had been dealing with illness and financial pressures, and Vincent feared he was becoming a burden to his brother. These feelings weighed heavily on him. In his letters to Theo, Vincent often expressed gratitude for his support, but also hinted at his fears about the future. He wondered if his work would ever be truly valued, or if it would fade into obscurity after his death. These doubts did not stop him from painting, but they added a layer of urgency to everything he created. Each canvas seemed to carry the weight of his thoughts. Dr. Gachet noticed Vincent's mood swings and tried to encourage him to focus on the beauty around him. Sometimes they painted together or discussed art in the doctor's garden. Yet even Gachet's kindness could not completely ease Vincent's sense of isolation. He still felt that he was living on the edge between recovery and relapse. The rapid pace of his work in Auvers reflected both his passion and his inner struggle. In less than 3 months, he produced landscapes, portraits, and still lifes, each infused with intense color and energy. His brushstrokes were bold and deliberate, often layered thickly to create texture and depth. The village residents became accustomed to seeing him out in the fields with his easel, his straw hat, shading him from the summer sun. One of the most moving aspects of this time is the way Vincent captured the atmosphere of Auvers. He painted not just what he saw, but what he felt. The golden wheat seemed to sway with an almost human longing. The skies opened wide above the land in shades of blue, grey and gold, and the roads stretched endlessly as if leading to some unknown destination. His art from Auvers is both vibrant and deeply personal, a final chapter written in colour and light. Yet as June turned into July, Vincent's mental state began to decline again. He wrote to Theo about feeling like a failure despite the beauty he was creating. He worried about Theo's ability to support his family and about his own place in the world. The pressure he placed on himself to produce more paintings seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Still, he continued to paint often, working from morning until evening. His last works are some of his most emotionally charged, including Wheatfield with Crows, which shows a dark sky filled with swirling black birds over a path that leads nowhere. Some art historians see this as a reflection of his despair, others as simply another example of his dramatic style. Either way, it is a painting that stays in the mind long after you see it. Vincent's time in Auvers was both a creative high point and an emotional low point. He was surrounded by beauty and supported by people who cared for him, yet he could not escape the shadow of his illness. His art from this period is among the most celebrated in the history of painting, and it stands as a testament to the intensity with which he lived and worked. In many ways, Auvers offered Vincent a final chance at peace, but it also brought him face to face with the limits of his strength. His days there were filled with light colour and movement, yet also with moments of deep silence and reflection. Each painting from those 2 months tells part of the story, a story of a man who saw the world with unmatched clarity and transformed that vision into something timeless and unforgettable. By the middle of July 1890, Vincent's time in Auvers-sur-Oise seemed as full of artistic energy as ever, but beneath that outward burst of creativity, a storm was gathering in his mind. He had painted nearly every day since his arrival, producing works that would later be recognized as masterpieces. Yet he could not quiet the thoughts that troubled him. He felt an increasing sense of being a burden to Theo, who was facing health issues of his own, as well as financial pressures from supporting both his family and Vincent. In his letters, Vincent still spoke of his love for painting and the beauty of the countryside, but he also hinted at a deep weariness. He worried that his work would never find the recognition it deserved during his lifetime, and that Theo was sacrificing too much for his sake. He feared that the strain was affecting Theo's marriage and health. These concerns settled over him like a shadow that no amount of sunlight or wheat fields could fully lift. On the surface, life in Auvers continued quietly. Vincent rose early each morning, took his paints and easel out to the fields or gardens, and worked until the light began to fade. He painted the church, the town hall, the rolling hills, the cottages, and the endless fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He still visited Dr. Gachet, who encouraged him to keep working and to focus on the joy that art brought him. But Vincent's mood was unpredictable, and his moments of calm could quickly give way to restlessness. During this time, he painted some of his most haunting works, including Wheatfield Under Thunderclouds and Wheatfield with crows. Both paintings carry an unusual weight. The skies in these works are heavy and dark, filled with movement that feels almost alive. The paths in the fields twist and lead nowhere. The crows in the second painting seem to rush across the canvas in a way that feels urgent and unsettled. Whether or not Vincent meant them as a reflection of his own state of mind, these paintings would later be seen as symbols of his final emotional battles. Theo visited Vincent in mid-July, bringing his wife Johanna and their young son. Vincent was happy to see them, but the visit was short, and afterward he felt the emptiness of their absence even more strongly. His letters from this time suggest a man who was increasingly convinced that his life was nearing its end, and that it might be better for everyone if he were no longer a source of worry. On the afternoon of July 27th, 1890, Vincent left the Ravu Inn with his easel and paints, as he had done so many times before. But instead of setting up to paint, he walked to a quiet field on the edge of the village. What happened there is still debated by historians, but most accounts agree that Vincent shot himself in the chest using a small revolver. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. He somehow managed to walk back to the inn, holding himself upright despite the pain. When the innkeepers saw him struggling to climb the stairs to his room, they called for Dr. Gachet and another physician. The doctors realized the bullet had lodged in his body and that surgery would be dangerous. They made Vincent as comfortable as possible, but could do little to save him. Theo was sent for and arrived the next day, finding his brother lying in bed, pale but conscious. The brothers spoke quietly. Vincent reportedly told Theo that he had done it for his own good and that he felt it was the best thing for everyone. Theo stayed by his side through the night, holding his hand and speaking to him gently. Despite the pain, Vincent seemed calm and resigned. In the early morning hours of July 29th, 1890, he died at the age of 37. His last reported words to Theo were, "This is how I wanted to go." Theo was devastated. He arranged for Vincent's burial in Auvers. The funeral took place the next day, attended by Dr. Gachet, a few local friends and fellow artists. Vincent's coffin was covered in yellow sunflowers, a tribute to the bright colors he loved so much. His paintings were propped against the walls surrounding him, as if the art he had created was keeping him company one last time. Theo himself would not live much longer. Only 6 months after Vincent's death, his health worsened and he died in January 1891 at the age of 33. He was buried in Utrecht, but in 1914, Johanna had his remains moved to Auvers so that the brothers could rest side by side. Today their graves lie next to each other covered with ivy, a lasting symbol of their bond. Vincent's death marked the end of a life filled with both suffering and beauty. He had struggled with mental illness, poverty, and isolation, yet he left behind more than 2,000 artworks in a career that lasted barely a decade. His paintings were unlike anything the world had seen at the time. Their bold colors, swirling skies, and emotional intensity spoke not just of the world outside, but of the world within the mind of the artist. At the time of his death, Vincent was largely unknown. His works had been exhibited only a few times and had sold rarely. But Theo's wife Johanna dedicated herself to preserving and promoting his legacy. She organized exhibitions, corresponded with art dealers and collectors, and carefully preserved his letters. Through her efforts and the growing admiration of fellow artists, Vincent's work began to gain recognition in the decades after his passing. The final days in Auvers show a complex portrait of a man at once filled with artistic fire and weighed down by despair. In those last weeks, he created paintings that are now counted among the greatest in history. They reveal a mind that could see beauty even in the shadow of its own decline, and a spirit that expressed itself fully through the language of color and form. Today, visitors to Auvers-sur-Oise can walk the same streets Vincent once walked. They can stand in the wheat fields he painted, see the church he immortalized, and visit the small room in the Ravu Inn where he spent his final nights. The village still carries the quiet air of the countryside, but it also holds the memory of an artist whose final chapter there was both a triumph of creativity and a tragedy of the human heart. Vincent's story does not end with his death. It lives on in every brushstroke, in every canvas, and in every person who finds in his art a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. His life reminds us that beauty can emerge even from the depths of pain, and that the vision of one person can touch the world long after they are gone. After Vincent's passing, the small village of Auvers-sur-Oise slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, but for those who had known him, the absence was heavy. The Ravoux Inn no longer saw the solitary figure setting off each morning with his easel and paints. The fields and gardens he had captured in vivid colours now lay unchanged under the summer sun. Yet they felt different, as if the life that had translated them onto canvas had vanished. The villagers spoke of him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, recalling the quiet painter who worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk. Theo returned to Paris carrying the weight of grief. His health was already fragile, and his brother's death had shaken him deeply. He tried to keep working in the art trade, but the strain was too much. Within weeks, his condition worsened, and by January 1891, Theo himself had passed away. Their deaths came so close together that it was hard for friends and family to think of one without the other. In life, they had been bound by love, loyalty, and shared struggle, and now they were bound in death. It was Johanna van Gogh, Theo's young widow, who took it upon herself to preserve Vincent's legacy. She inherited a large collection of his paintings, drawings, and letters, and understood the importance of sharing them with the world. At a time when women had little influence in the art world, she became the driving force behind the recognition Vincent would eventually receive. She organized exhibitions in the Netherlands, France, and Germany. She published a collection of Vincent's letters, which revealed the depth of his thoughts, his passion for art, and his struggles with mental health. Through these letters, the world came to know not just the painter, but the person. They revealed a man who cared deeply about the beauty of nature, about capturing the lives of ordinary people, and about expressing something true through color and form. His words were as vivid as his paintings, and they gave audiences a new understanding of what had fueled his creativity. As the years passed, other artists began to recognize Vincent's genius. Painters of the early 20th century saw in his bold brushwork and intense colors a freedom they themselves sought. His influence could be felt in the works of the Expressionists, the Fauves, and countless others who admired his ability to pour raw emotion onto the canvas. His art spoke a language that went beyond technique, reaching into the very core of human experience. By the early 1900s, exhibitions of Vincent's work were drawing attention from critics and collectors. His paintings, which had once sold for almost nothing, began to command higher prices. Museums and private galleries sought to acquire them, and his name was becoming known far beyond the small circles that had first seen his art. In Amsterdam, the Van Gogh Museum would one day be built to house the largest collection of his works, ensuring that future generations could stand before them and feel the same emotional force that had poured from his brush. Yet even as his fame grew, the story of Vincent's life became a subject of fascination and sometimes misunderstanding. Some portrayed him as a tragic madman whose genius came at the cost of sanity. Others saw him as a martyr to art who sacrificed everything for his vision. The truth as revealed in his letters and the memories of those who knew him was more complex. He was a man who suffered greatly, but who also loved deeply, who experienced joie in the smallest details, and who never lost his dedication to his craft. In Auvers-sur-Oise, the memory of Vincent and Theo slowly became part of the village's identity. Their graves lie side by side, covered in a blanket of green ivy. Visitors from around the world come to pay their respects, leaving flowers and quiet words. The wheat fields still ripple in the summer wind. The church still stands with its distinctive angles, and the streets still echo faintly with the steps of the man who once walked them brush in hand, Searching for the perfect view, Vincent's journey from obscurity to global recognition is one of the most remarkable in the history of art. He lived most of his life in poverty, often trading paintings for meals or supplies. He endured rejection from art dealers, ridicule from some of his peers, and the isolation that came from being misunderstood. Yet within his lifetime, he never stopped painting. He worked with an urgency, as if he knew time was short and that every day mattered. That relentless drive left the world with a body of work that continues to inspire awe. Today, his paintings hang in the most prestigious museums, from the Musée d'Orsay in Paris to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam's Starry Night Sunflowers. The bedroom and countless others are studied, admired and loved by millions. They are not just images on canvas. They are pieces of the man himself, fragments of his vision and his soul. Vincent's influence extends far beyond the art world. His story has inspired books, plays, films and songs. He has become a symbol of perseverance for those who create without recognition, for those who struggle with inner battles, and for those who believe in beauty, even when the world does not see it. His life is a reminder that value is not always measured in immediate success, that sometimes the seeds planted in obscurity grow into forests that shade generations to come. For those who walk the same paths he once did, the connection is tangible. Standing in the fields of Auvers, you can almost feel the weight of the sky he painted. You can see the shapes of the roofs he sketched and the colors of the flowers he captured in thick strokes of oil. It is as if the landscape still remembers him, as if his spirit lingers in the air, blending with the scent of the earth and the whisper of the wind. In the end, Vincent van Gogh's legacy is not defined solely by his struggles, nor solely by his achievements. It is defined by the way he saw the world and the way he shared that vision with such honesty and passion. His paintings do not just show us what he saw, they show us how he felt. They invite us to step inside his mind, to experience the light, the color, and the emotion. As he did. Over a century after his death, his art continues to bridge the gap between artist and viewer, making strangers feel like they have known him all their lives. That is the true power of his legacy. It is not bound by time or place. It exists wherever someone stands before one of his works and feels something stir in their own heart. Vincent once wrote that what he wanted most was to leave behind something that would console people. That wish has been granted. His art has comforted, inspired, and moved countless souls. And it will continue to do so for as long as there are eyes to see and hearts to feel. His life may have ended in that quiet village, but his presence remains alive in every stroke of paint, every burst of color, and every person who stands in awe before the vision of a man who gave everything for art. And so we reach the end of Vincent van Gogh's story, a life painted in bold strokes of color and shadow. His genius burned bright, but it came with a cost. He lived in a world where beauty and pain were forever intertwined. Each brushstroke carried the weight of his struggles and the light of his vision. Van Gogh's suffering did not define him, but it shaped the way he saw the world. It gave him the depth to capture sunsets that glowed with hope and fields that seemed to breathe with life. His art still speaks across time, whispering to those who have felt the sting of hardship and the warmth of creativity. We may never fully understand the mind of Vincent van Gogh, but we can stand before his work and feel a little of what he felt. The turbulence, the loneliness, the bursts of joy. He left behind a legacy that reminds us that even in the midst of struggle, the human spirit can create something unforgettable. So when you see the swirling sky of the starry night, or the blazing yellows of his sunflowers, remember the man who gave them to the world, a man who painted through pain and left us beauty that will never fade.